saying, okay, this is the sprint work that I want to do. And then I'll start asking questions about, okay, well, what are you guys doing for lifting? What are you doing for recovery? What are you doing for maybe explosive or elastic power? And if I have to start stepping in and provide my recommendations around those elements, then great. But hopefully it all integrates properly and things aren't interfering with each other. And the other thing I'm going to constantly say is you can't get too far away from sprinting. I find that people like what I prescribe, and then they think that it's just going to kind of just stick forever. So if we do, a 6 or 12 week training program, they're all like, oh, great, right? And then they walk away from it rather than understanding there's a maintenance component that has to maintain your fitness and your speed. And that's the most important part, is just integrating that into the infrastructure and making sure that they understand, okay, well, we always have to sprint. The volume could go up, it could go down, but it always has to be present. So I'll speak to that quite a bit in this presentation. So establishing sprinting as a priority, I think we take it for granted. Like, oh, of course we want to be fast when I walk into an organization. But they have to understand why it's important and how we maintain that quality or improve that quality. So I'm constantly educating. So if you walk into a room and you're the sprint expert or the speed expert, you have to sell. You have to talk to the athletes. You have to talk to the coaches, like I said, the administrators, parents. Sometimes it's going to be sport agents, and always medical staff have to be involved. And I'm involved in a lot of rehabilitation around hamstrings. And so I have to have these conversations with the medical staff constantly about, okay, we have to get them sprinting as soon as possible, or at least elements of sprinting, for it to be a successful return to play. And usually that freaks them out. So, those relationships have to be strong for you to get something accomplished on the speed side. Always deliver your message within the context of sport. I come from an athletics, a track and field background, and it's not the same. You have to be able to speak to their sport. I worked with everything from ice hockey to field hockey to rugby, American football, regular football, you name it. And I've had to learn more about their sport than they've had to learn about what I'm providing. So make sure you can deliver your content in regards to how it applies to their sport using their language, because then again it builds trust and you'll be able to get farther with all of your work in that organization. Make it easy for them to follow your lead. Make it simple. If it's something like, and I'll go over this, if it's something like you're just getting them to sprint 10 meters 10 times per session, then great, that's easy to follow. If you have to pull out hurdles and sleds and equipment and it's just difficult to implement, it's going to be harder to sell. So if you can get your work, get it done, get in there, get out, and use simple terms so that they don't feel like, oh, I don't understand and you're making me feel a little insecure about myself. I found that empowering them around implementing all of this stuff is very important. So make it easy, make it simple. And I say get your foothold for your programming. You're always trying to buy time, whether it's, can I have more time in the warm up? Can I have 10 minutes here? Can I have 15 minutes here? And so you have to, again, you're selling and you're advocating for your type of training, which is the speed training. And unfortunately, we've had to do this with gym training a lot with sports, but that seems to be coming around. Every facility has, a big weight room and racks and weights and all that. But do they have a place where you can sprint? Do they have a track surface? Do they have a dedicated area? Do they have enough distance and room indoors? So you're constantly advocating for this type of training until we get to a point where everybody accepts, okay, we have to do sprinting and we can't just let them play basketball or football and hope that they run fast enough. And so part of that education is like, okay, in acceleration for an elite sprinter, by 6 strides, you're up to 70% of max velocity. And understanding, well, at least we should be able to run 6, 7, 8 strides, get up to 75%, 80% of max velocity. We don't need a lot of room, but we need to get this done, whether it's in warm up or wherever. The idea is that in most team sports, you're not getting to max velocity. You have a very finite amount of distance to cover to get, to cover somebody, to get to the ball. So it's going to be shorter sprints. So if you have to carve out a space or a time for you, you can get it done with 7 strides. And I've done that a lot, where I've said, okay, just give me 10 meters. That's all I need. And then I just build volume with that. And it works very well for team sport settings, right? And if you have different types of athletes, whether it's a sprinter, this is American football receiver, American football lineman. So there's obviously a football lineman could be like 350 pounds or 140 kilos. So you want to make sure that they're traveling shorter acceleration distances, because that's kind of their domain in their sport. Whereas somebody who's like a midfielder or a striker in football might want to be sprinting out a little farther, 40 meters, right? And you're trying to figure out where everybody fits into your sprint program, and making it relatable. Because if you make your big guys run long distances, they're going to get hurt and they're going to hate you. Right. I put this chart together with Charlie Francis, 20 years ago, and we looked at, well, okay, if these different sports or athletes have to work over whatever, 30 yards, 20 yards, then what are the important elements that are going to help them? Obviously, the sprinting over those distances, but then weights become more important for the first 5 to 10 yards or meters of an effort. Right. And then medicine ball throws and plyometrics become more interesting as you kind of move through the continuum. So you're trying to build your sprint program and then start inputting different training elements, whether it's weights, whether it's med ball throws, whether it's plyometrics, to make sure it kind of builds that athlete to fit their sport. And rarely are you going to train any of these team sport athletes like a 100-meter sprinter or anything above that distance. So you're having to steal some elements from the track and field world and go, this is all we need, and let's apply it with our specific sport and our specific athletes. Okay, so I say start with good mechanical principles. Most important thing is establish some standards around movement. Like, you should be able to look at people and go, okay, yep, that guy's good, that girl's good, and they check off the boxes in terms of the technical elements, whether that's their posture. And I say eye tracking because wherever I look, a lot of the time my spine will follow or my body will follow. So make sure they're looking in the right place when they're accelerating or running, because that'll influence it heavily. Limb movements, are the limbs tracking in the right, plane? Are they crossing the body? Is there enough amplitude with the limb movements? And then I always say, like, you should have some degree of video feedback so they can see what they look like when they run, because most of us are unaware of what we look like. We think we're doing something, and then when you see the video, you're like, oh, geez, that looks horrible. Or sometimes they will do good things and they'll think it's awkward. They'll think, no, that can't be right. And then I'll show them the video and I'm like, look, this looks really good. So keep doing that, even though it feels awkward. It feels awkward because you haven't been doing that before. This is new, which is a good thing. And there might be an initial decrement in performance, but once they sort of consolidate that new technique, you can build on that and get them to sort of higher velocities. So I delineate between acceleration and max velocity because in one sense, they're similar in terms of where the limbs track. They track vertically in relation to the body, but in acceleration, you're leaning, and in max velocity, you're more upright. So there's a greater body lean. So the distribution of force and stress is a little different in acceleration. It's a little more posterior oriented in terms of like the calves and the feet. There's more stress through the Achilles tendon on acceleration, and it tends to be more quad dominant. So there's more knee flexion on ground contact. Whereas when you get to maximum velocity, upright, taller hip position, and more stress on the hamstrings, right? And this is why when you sprint a little further out, you'll see people are more susceptible to hamstring strain. So understanding the difference between acceleration and what it does for you versus max velocity and the stresses is pretty important, especially when you get into rehab scenarios. So if I have somebody with a hamstring injury, we spend more time initially on acceleration because of that less exposure to the hamstring. Lots of flexion, knee flexion on ground contact, which means it's more quad dominant. Still means the hamstring's working, but you're not putting it into that late swing phase where you'll get injured. If I have somebody who has a calf strain, probably, or Achilles problem, or a plantar fascia issue, I'm probably going to have them do more upright drills and running because less stress on those structures. So thinking about those things is really important in how we actually carry out a workout, will involve either acceleration and or max velocity, depending on what you're targeting. And I'll show you how I do that. So I use this symbol a lot. It was sort of like an accident, a happy accident, where we were using Dartfish Express on an iPad and just drawing lines. And I'm like, hey, somebody said, oh, that looks kind of like a hashtag when somebody did it well. So in acceleration, it's kind of an angled hashtag, but you see how the femur and the tibia all line up and at right angles are parallel lines, and the upper body versus the lower body. And that, most of us intuitively know that's what it should look like, right? But sometimes the athletes have no clue. So if you draw this on there, they're like, oh, okay, I get it, right? So I think it works well for the less educated people. It's like a very simple way to talk about biomechanics without talking angles and angular velocity and all that. And in upright sprinting, it's just a little more upright, but the same symbol applies in terms of how the upper body relates to the lower body and how posture is oriented, whether it's from the ankle to the hip to the knee, or the head. So usually it fits, right? So here's a video. Hopefully this works. And I will use Dartfish Express on these videos, and I'll do, I'll draw on there, and then I'll send it to the athlete and say, hey, look, you're hitting the right positions, right? And everything looks pretty symmetrical. So that's, you're doing a good job. And then I'll show this across, let's look at some female athletes, right? World-class sprinters, they're hitting the same positions essentially, right? So I want them to understand, again, this is part of my education and my sales job. I'm constantly showing people, the same thing at a very high level, and they start to buy in, like, oh, okay, I understand why we're doing what we're doing. So, and then this is at when my kids were young, I'd go to their track meets and I would film other kids and make fun of them. No, actually, I'm just looking for examples of who's good and who's not. And so this kid's in last place, and he's pushing and he's fumbling all over the place, and things aren't lining up as they should. So I want to show examples of what is good, but at the same time, when somebody's deficient, you can use this to show that, hey, you're just not hitting the right positions. And a lot of the time that has to do with strength and power and the ability to deliver the force properly, and then things line up better. But if you're not strong enough, you'll get these irregular shapes. So in max velocity, we're always talking about hip height and where you land. If somebody's running efficiently at max velocity, you'll see that the hip is very high and they're landing close to just in front of the center of mass when they hit the ground. So you got this fully inflated ball, as opposed to the partially inflated ball or the squished tomato, where somebody's landing way out in front and the hip drops, and it's just less efficient, and it's harder on the hamstring during the late swing phase when you hit the ground. Now, if somebody is a team sport athlete and they have to cut and change direction, they want to be a flat ball or a tomato because it creates more friction for that direction change. But when you reaccelerate and get up to maximum velocity, you want to make sure that they can change those shapes properly. So this is my example of the fully inflated ball when you throw it down the court versus the partially inflated ball, and it just sort of splats, right? If you apply the same force, if you're elastic, you're going to travel farther and much more efficiently. So when I talk about team sports, I did this for American football, and I had to explain the hip height and how it changes by position. So if you're starting from a low position and you're going to hit somebody, you have to have a low center of mass and you have to bring your hips down. If you're going to run fast like a 100-meter sprinter, then everything has to rise up. If you're going to decelerate again and change direction, you can see how the people have to go below that hip height line, the standing hip height line, to change direction. So as long as you are educating people on the differences between why you get your hips down and why you get them up, they'll be able to, accommodate that within their practice and their game. But that you do have to kind of spoon feed them and tell them what the difference is, right? I talk a lot when I coach about arm contribution. If somebody has a strong arm drive, it's going to level out their posture. If somebody has a weak, and I call it backside, where they're just swinging their arms backwards, it tends to curve them over and they have less optimal posture. So this upward, I always say upward arm drive when they accelerate will straighten them out. And it's not a core strength or stability issue, it's a coordination issue, a limb coordination issue. So always talk about how the arms have to drive to the front side of the body. And I always say up and away. is my cue for that. And you don't want things circling back into you, but you want them high enough that it creates a sort of a lengthening or a straightening of the posture, and it matches the opposite leg on the opposite side of the body. So you see the upper arm is relatively parallel to the opposite femur. When we talk drills, I keep my drills really basic. So I'm a product of doing athletics in the 70s and 80s and learning from Gerard Mock, who was originally from Poland, and he came up with these drills because they had to work in gymnasiums during the winter and work on something that would strengthen them for sprinting when they got out onto the track in the spring. So, they call them the mock drills. They're the A, Bs, and Cs, and I use those mostly the A series. So I say it provides specific strength development for the core, for the hip flexors, the extensors. There's a skill acquisition component too. So we're teaching people how to move their limbs. And I always talk about vertical force production. And then when I use it in rehabilitation and return to play, the drills are like that initial progression of like rebuilding gait, rebuilding strength in a safe manner. So I use these A drills a lot, and you'll see. So I say specific strength development, hip flexors, hip extensors, lower leg strength, stiffness, and elasticity is very important. Restoring those components, whether it's a knee injury, an ankle injury, or even a hamstring injury. If you make somebody more elastic and they bounce more, it takes a lot of stress off of all of those other structures in the body. So you're not pushing and pulling and grinding. So I use those drills for a lot of specific strengthening. There's the marching drill, which everybody probably knows, the skipping drill, and the running high knee drill. So the marching A is limb mechanics and posture and just making sure people are in the right position. The skipping adds an elasticity component where they can snap off the ground and you add velocity to the limbs. And the running A is more like actual running, but we're working in an upright posture and working on vertical force production and quick ground contact times. So I use, and I don't know if you guys still have phone boxes or phone booths around, but I show this to the kids and I'm like, hey, this used to be around a lot before you had smartphones, right? And I said, you should be able to produce force in that phone booth or that phone box, right? So, having some metaphors for them to understand, sometimes I say, hey, if you're in a prison cell, you can do sprint drills. But, make it interesting for them and make them understand conceptually what you're trying to accomplish is putting force into the ground. So this is an example of just the A march, and all we're talking about is nice tall posture and getting the limbs moving up and down. I don't need reaching. I don't need grabbing or pushing. Keep it very simple. I like, and this is something I didn't do initially, but I've been working with a lot of general population people and we found that they had poor posture. And so when we added some sort of resistance to it, it put them in better posture, pushed their hips forward, and they could do the drill easier. So now, a lot of the time, I will start with some sort of light resistance, whether it's uphill or using bands with partners, and it just helps to put them in a better position. So, like I said, I might have started without it in the past, but now we always just start because it's a nice teaching progression to have that resistance to set up posture. Okay, and the skipping has more velocity downwards, more elasticity. Try to make sure they don't sort of curl forward at the hip. They want to stay nice and tall. And then the running A, which is more like actual running. Okay, so those are the A series, and this is an example again of the resistance, which will add a little bit of a lean, which is a little closer to the acceleration posture, but I'll add in all these nuances with these drills and make sure that we have sort of a picture in their head of what the drill should look like. This is an example of a American football player. And what I like about this is he's very fast. I think he was, runs close to a 10-second 100 and fast 40-yard dash and one of the top players in the NFL. But you'll see how he can produce force through the progression of this drill. And you can see how much force he's putting in and the frequency. If somebody can do that in a drill, then you can certainly bet that they're going to be able to move on the field. So getting through that same range, same knee height, and producing force. They have a little bit of a band here, but I like the idea that, okay, if he can do that, I know that he can move on the field. So the drills do help set a lot of this stuff up. And there's a lot of discussion around front side versus backside running mechanics. And I always look at their position when they're either accelerating or upright, and I want the leg moving to the front side of that plane, right? So, a lot of people think that acceleration is all backside, but in my definition, if they're accelerating properly, they're getting to the front side and down. We're just inclining them over a bit. So I want to get that knee up. It doesn't have to get up too high, just about hip height, and then put force back into the ground. And the arms should be mirroring that on the opposite side. So whether you're accelerating or whether you're at max velocity, you're still defining it as, let's get to the front side and then apply force to the ground. I don't want things pushing out the back, because if they are pushing, it means they're on the ground too long and they're interrupting the next stride. So determining time and energy available in your program, your process. Is it an off-season condition? Is it a preseason phase? Or is it in season? Because it's going to change how much time you have and how much energy they have. How many sessions per week can you fit in? Ideally, you're seeing them maybe 2 times per week to work solely on acceleration and sprinting. How much time is allowed for each session? That may depend on, again, if it's off season or in season, what the coaching staff allow. In the US, there's rules around how much you can train at the collegiate level. What would precede or follow your session? So knowing, okay, what happened before and what's going to happen after will dictate how you plan your session. Because if they're doing something very strenuous before, you might have to bring down velocities and keep the volume low in your session. And I don't like people weightlifting before they sprint, so I'll always try to put the lifting after. So understanding all of that, it becomes a real organizational challenge. So the reality is, you could have anywhere from 1 to 4 times per week. The most common, I said, is 2 times per week. Session duration. I've heard people, like I've had American football teams call me up and say, they're only giving us 10 minutes to do in speed work. I'm like, oh, good luck. So you may have to negotiate to get more time, 30 minutes, 45 minutes. If you can get 60 minutes in a professional team environment, that's laughing. Like that's a good situation, but it's not very common. And then what's the program duration? Is it 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks? Again, NFL, you might have 5 weeks in your off season to work on speed, and it might be 5 weeks, 2 times per week, 30 minutes each, which isn't a lot. So we always look at, like, I'm an athletics track and field person, and I always had this great off-season training build up before we got into competitions. And this is what I was used to planning for. But we know the reality is a lot different in team sports. It's maybe this sort of short, truncated, compressed, like, okay, we got to get fit. And then we have this really long in season. So it's very hard to build your speed qualities if you have this very short, off season period. And so so we'll get into some of those challenges as well. So like I said, NFL offseason, they finished it. 2 sessions per week. This is very common, maybe 30 to 45 minutes per session, including their warm up. You're always competing with position coaches or, the weight room and so it's very hard to get time. 5 weeks total. So I say, really, NFL, most teams have 10 sessions in a year to really dedicate towards, like I said, a 20 to 24 week competition period, which is unrealistic, right? So now you have to find ways in preseason and in season to get some sprint work done if you really want to have fast athletes who don't get injured. Okay, so I talk a lot about microdosing in my presentations. And the idea is, okay, well, we have to get short sessions done in season in order to keep this going. We have an off season and then we have an in season with spikes of sprint work. Now, if we had a great off season where lots of time and we're sprinting, when we get into in season, you don't need as many, stressors or spikes in time to kind of keep them from slowing down too much. If you have a shorter off season, now I need more frequency in terms of those spikes of sprint work in order to either maintain or improve preparedness, right? So I'm always working with teams to figure out, okay, you had 5 weeks in the off season. We have to find time in the in season period where you keep them working on sprinting, and we can't count practice or games because we know that those speeds aren't high enough. We can look at the data. The GPS data tells us that mostly people are walking or jogging or maybe having short accelerations that don't reach high speed. So you have to have some degree of other work to satisfy those requirements so they improve. Otherwise, people will get slower and they'll get injured, right? So if we look at when I was a track coach and I was working with elite sprinters, this would be my progression. We might do a warm up, we might do some drills or some jumps, then we work on starts and acceleration, change of direction for multi-sport athletes. Then we work at late acceleration or max velocity, and then we might work on some speed endurance for track athletes. So over 100 meters, 150, 200 meters. So this was a lot of work, and it might take me 2 hours to get through this as a track coach. I can't do this as a team sport strength and conditioning coach. This is ridiculous. You get laughed out of the organization, right? So then I have to start going, well, if I only have one session per week, what's important? And for the most part, I would say the first four steps here is like I'm going to do some warm up, some drills, some starts, and some early acceleration work, and maybe some resisted work. I won't necessarily get into late acceleration or maximum velocity, and maybe plyometrics is a little too risky, but certainly I want to hit those priority areas, which I call like starts and accelerations, if you're only seeing them once per week, right? If I get 2 sessions per week, I can add more things and get a little fancier, but I'll separate it out. Maybe I do one day where it's just more starts and resisted acceleration. And then the next day we might add, some change of direction, and maybe we do a little less resisted sprints. Maybe, you can vary it up. Maybe it's a little more late acceleration, but then you can start separating things out. And then if you have 3 days per week that you work, then you can do a lot of different things. You can do flying start work for max velocity on day one. And the second day you might do speed changes, fast, easy, fast. And then on the last day, you might do more sport specific agility, curve sprints, change of direction, as part of it. But the more days you have, the more you can start to add different elements. So you're always fighting for more days so that you can diversify what you're offering to the athlete. So I fall back on this. Prioritize starts and acceleration. Most team sports require repeat acceleration proficiency. So the ability to accelerate powerfully throughout the duration of the game is determined by your training. So if you do lots of repetitions, when they get to the game, it's easy. But if if you've just done conditioning work, it's different. The accelerations are very demanding. So you have to develop specific endurance around repeat acceleration. And that doesn't mean shuttles. It might just mean acceleration, walk back, take your time, do it again, and do 10 to 20 of those. It can really help. And it has to be done year round to build abilities or develop resiliency in soft tissues. So that's what I'm constantly fighting for when I work with teams is I need them to do this throughout the year. So I develop classifications around hard starts or soft starts. So the hard starts are, you'll see here, starting blocks, 3-point starts. You're starting from lower position, push up off the ground, and you're developing strength and power as part of that start and that sprint. More energy is required to conduct this start, right? So that's where your focus is. And then on another day, you might do a softer start, which is a higher position. And what you're trying to do there is you're trying to free up energy so that you can use it in the rest of the run. So maybe we're doing hard starts over 10 meters, and I might do flying starts over 20 to 30 meters because I want to develop that high velocity, max velocity piece. So understanding how to use the starts can be very important when you're doing your programming. So this is a segmented push-up start. This is a great one just for teaching how to drive out from a low position. So you don't rush it, push up. The commands are push up, step, and go. And you can see it just forces them into a nice acceleration position there, right? So we're working on the posture. You got to get some strength work there. Okay. This is the explosive push-up start. It's just go, and I'll usually do that later. So that's a harder start in terms of like the amount of force required. And that's my son. So he doesn't lift that much. So he's got good sized legs. Like running will do it. This is a falling start. So this is a softer start. We get him to do an arm rehearsal, fall, and just easier. So instead of coming up from the ground, he's falling towards the ground, a little less energy required. And like I said, getting them to coordinate their arms as part of that start and that acceleration is really important for balancing out their posture. Okay. Other soft starts, this would be a walk-in, so 5-yard, 5-meter walk-in, and then go. So you're unloading the start so that he can run and use his energy more efficiently down throughout the run itself. And I use this early in a general preparatory phase so that people aren't putting too much stress in their calves and their Achilles blowing off the line. This is more of a flying start. So this is a 20-meter buildup. And then he goes hard from there. So that's working more max velocity down the line, and I'm unloading the start. Okay. If you use resisted training, a lot of studies on this now, and it can be helpful, especially for developing athletes and people who aren't as familiar with sprinting. It develops specific strength. I usually say I'm looking to not load them more than a 10% decrement of their time. So if they're running 30 meters at 4 seconds, it might be a 4-4. I'm not a huge proponent of really heavy sleds. I just find that it just burns a lot of energy, and I can't get a lot of reps out of them. So, and there might be some changes in technique that I'm not really quite fond of. So the other part of it is if you have a large group and you have to have sleds out there, it sucks, like in terms of coordinating and getting the equipment out there, and how heavy should this one be for this guy versus that guy. So if all possible, I try not to use sleds for larger groups. There's some alternatives. You can get like sandbags that they sell now, and you drag them. I usually like having a longer tether on that. But, if you're working with individual athletes, it's a economical way of getting it done. I use resistance bands in groups for short accelerations because I just find it an easier workflow. I can carry the bands out there. I can have 12 bands on my back and it doesn't kill me. If I had 12 sleds, not good, or 6 sleds even. So we use the bands to set up start position, posture. It gives them a little more time to focus on their technique. You get some strength work. I usually go 5 to 10 meter distances because beyond that, it's not as effective, and you're just dragging somebody down the track. So the 3-inch bands I find are very useful. And you can see here what it does for posture. Right? It's just a good setup just for them to work on their acceleration posture, their upper body mechanics, and it works really well from a workflow perspective. I like if you have a hill or an incline. This is luxurious. This is a track that has an incline at a proper grade. We use this a lot just because I can get a lot of athletes through. I don't need a lot of equipment. It feels a little more natural to have them sprinting up a hill versus pulling a sled or dragging somebody behind them. And the whole point of doing this is it kind of slows things down so they can focus on technique, but they still get the benefit of the strength and power work of running up the hill. So if you have a hill, great. Usually I get asked, like, how steep should it be? And it's usually about 4 to 5 degrees, or 7 to 9%. And people will ask me, like, oh, how do you measure that? And you can get an inclinometer app for your phone. Like I have one for iPhone, and I just lay it on the hill and it says 5% or 5 degrees. I'm like, okay, great. So I don't need any survey equipment or anything like that. Usually wheelchair ramps are built to that grade, or parkade ramps, because they have to be spec'd to handle wheelchairs. So it's not difficult to find an incline. If you're on a grass surface, just make sure they're wearing cleats so they're not slipping. That's the most important thing. This was at the Minnesota Vikings American football team. I helped design sort of this. You can see one is more crowned or parabolic, so that it's kind of harder at the beginning and then it levels out. And then they have just more of a linear hill on the right side there and some stairs to walk back on, and they can do some jumps on the stairs. So it was kind of a neat build. But if you have the money to recommend this for your organization, great. It just, again, you can get more people through, and it's just an easier way to use resistance. I like adding, once in a while, adding some different starts with curve running. Um, I always get them to finish with a linear sprint, but if you want to add some nuances to it, I try not to mix agility and linear sprint work too much. But I do get requests for this a lot, so I'll show different examples of curve running and just sort of basic agility work forward and back. And a lot of people like to program this. I try to separate out a bit more, but I will provide this as part of my consultancy if people want it. In terms of recovery requirements, usually I kind of stick, when I talk pure speed, this 1 minute per 10 meters or yards covered. So if somebody's running 20 meters or 20 yards, they get a 2-minute break. If it's 50 yards, they get a 5-minute break. If it's 10 meters, it's a 1-minute break, right? So that's a good place to start. Now, if you're working with beginners or kids or people who are working submaximally, you can start to take that time down. So maybe 10 meters is 30 seconds and they just do a walk back, right? Or it's in a general preparatory phase where we're building fitness. You can start cutting that recovery time, and you can get more volume in, which is nice. If you're working maximal efforts for people who are elite athletes, you might have to expand that. So 20 meters might take 4 minutes if they're doing a hard start. A 60 meter for an elite sprinter might be 10 to 15 minutes. So it depends on your population and where you are in your training program. But the 1 minute per 10 meters or yards is sort of a healthy start to kind of gauge how you're going to program and how much time you need in your session. I'll people always ask, how much is enough? How much distance? How much volume? So if I'm working with track and field, people might have to do distances out to 250 meters for a 100-meter athlete, or 450 meters for a 400-meter athlete. Whereas when I get into things like basketball, most of the athletes might only have to run, like I said, 10 meters. I'm working with an athlete now, and he's one of the top players in the NBA. 10-meter sprints, that's all he does, because he's not going to accelerate farther than that in a basketball game. But we're loading up on the repetitions and the volume, right? Volleyball might be shorter. And I have these designations here, like I say, short to long or short to short or long to short. So short to long would be like, well, we start with 10 meters and then every month we go out another 10 meters to 20 or 30 or 40, right? Short to short is I just keep them at 10 meters through their training program, because there's really no need for them to sprint farther, right? If I'm working with a soccer goalkeeper, how often do they have to sprint farther than 10 meters, right? And they might have to run 20 meters to get to a ball, or 18 yards or whatever it is. But if they do enough volume over 10 meters, they're going to be fit enough to go beyond that distance as well. So thinking about each position in each sport is really important. And you can see how far they have to accelerate. So again, basketball athlete might be 10 meters and then they don't have to really accelerate any farther than that. Whereas a soccer midfielder, maybe get them to accelerate to 30 meters, and that determines their velocity. 100-meter sprinter is usually beyond 60 meters, and understanding what those needs are. So I've come up with some ideas, what I call speed reserve. If I have somebody who only has to sprint 10 meters in a game, maybe I get them to sprint at 20 meters so that they hit a higher velocity. So when they go back to the game, everything is easier. So your maximum speed capabilities, the higher they are, the easier everything else is when you go at submaximal. So I say like a Formula One car has to, go 220 to 240 miles per hour. But in the race, they don't really get up to that. They have to do a lot of turns and all that. But the horsepower is great enough, 750 horsepower, to allow them to exist in different domains. And that's what I'm trying to do with my sport athletes is, if I can increase their max velocity, then 80% of max velocity is now higher too. And so they can operate throughout the game, the match, at submaximal velocities and not burn as much energy and not as much stress on the tissues, because they're able to handle much higher velocities, but their operating velocity in the game and practice is quite lower. So I talk about, say, a football lineman or a basketball forward, even though their play and practice requirements might be only at 5 meters per second. When I train them, I'll train them to 7 meters per second, right? So I might run them out a little farther just to make sure that I have a buffer between what they've trained at, what they can handle, and what they're required in their game. So that's that speed reserve, right? Soccer defender, again, I might train them up to 8 meters per second, even though really they're going to exist around 6 meters per second, and so on, right? Soccer midfielder might get up to 10 meters per second in their training, where in their game they're just floating around and operating at an average lower velocity. And then again, as you go up the chain, we have American football receiver, and then this is a 100-meter sprinter where they have to, when they compete, be at their best. So you'll see I have these different arcs where I'm saying, okay, we're going to try to work super maximally from 0 to 20 or 0 to 30. And then you can start, having discrete workouts that handle that specific component. And that's the only case where that you're going to have that if you're working with track and field athletes. Everybody else operates in competition at lower velocities. So, I'm really trying to work on developing speed reserve all the time. And the whole idea is that if I get them to sprint maximally consistently, it's such a stressful stimulus. So if we look at this is again another diagram I created with Charlie Francis 20 years ago, and this idea that maximal sprinting is probably one of the more stressful things that you could ever do. And then you look at all the gym lifts, right? You have Olympic lifts, you have plyometrics, and then everything else. So if you're doing a bench press or upper body, it's less motor units, less demand on the central nervous system. So if you have sprinting as part of your program, you know that you're going to have a significant stressor as part of your overall program. If you don't, then you got to get it from somewhere. Maybe they are Olympic lifting, maybe they are doing more throws and jumps. But a lot of the time, everybody seems to regress towards the right side of this graph and like, let's do gym work, let's do bodybuilding, let's do conditioning work, which doesn't hit the nervous system in the same way. So that's why I always start with maximal sprinting or acceleration as a base, and then I start building things around that. You don't score goals by lifting weights, you do it by running and getting into position and defending as well. So I call this my short to short progression. If you are working with athletes and you have limited space and you only have 10 meters or 10 yards, this could be a progression. Every week, I try to build it out so that we have, it might be 2 times per week, 3 times per week. I change the type of start. I might start with a softer start and then do more explosive starts, but you can see the volume goes up. If I can get in 500 meters per session, that's a lot. That's very stressful. And if you try this yourself, and the way I do it is I sprint 10 meters, decelerate 10 meters, set up again and run back. So it's a 3-cone drill where you sprint 10, decelerate, turn around, and you should be able to get 10 reps done in 90 seconds. So a minute and a half, take a 3-minute break, do it again. So it doesn't take long to do a 500-meter workout. It is very stressful, but you get the benefit of having 50 10-meter accelerations in that workout. And that's, nobody's doing that. But if you work with an athlete who wants to improve, if they do that consistently, they'll be very resilient and they'll be very powerful. So I use this short to short progression a lot. And really it's part of my hamstring rehab progression. That's where it started. People would get hurt, hamstring injury, and we would take them through this 10-meter progression. And we found that at the end of it, they were fitter, they were faster, they were resilient. And it's like, why don't we do this all the time? So it was another happy accident where I was just having athletes do sprint work as part of the rehab, not practicing, not playing games. And when they came back, they were fitter than when they were, a regular practicing and competing athlete. So that made me think that's the missing component. Those intense 10-meter accelerations were something that was missing from their practice and their game schedule. So developing that volume is very important. So this is sort of, again, the short to long versus long to short. And the whole idea between short to long is that you get more accelerations in. If you're doing longer conditioning runs than trying to get faster, you just lose time. And you don't stress the nervous system enough, where if you're doing short to short or short to long, it's just a better fit for team sport. And, this could be a progression. This could be weeks or months, and I'll do 0 to 10 for a period. Then I might go up to 20, 30, 40, and then I start doing flying starts, and then I start doing speed changes, 10-meter fast, 10-meter easy, which is just a maintenance. It's not, they don't slow down, and then they reaccelerate, easy, fast, easy, and you can see where it's going. But the idea is they're getting in more acceleration, and they're building velocity progressively so that their hamstrings can handle it. It's not a shock to their system, right? I use maintenance segments a lot. So when I said those fast, easy, fast, or even when I'm trying to get people to progress from, say, 10 to 20 meters, I might make them do 10 plus 10. So they do 10 accelerate, and then they maintain for another 10 rather than pushing for the full 20. It just gives them exposure to more volume. And it's, like I say, prepares athletes for the next phase of longer segments. So you see here, the first couple of workouts might be 0 to 10. And then I go, okay, I'm going to put a couple of cones out. I want you to accelerate to the first cone and then just kind of cruise and maintain your velocity, right? And then it makes it easier to go 0 to 20 in the next workout. So I'm just tailing on these maintenance segments so that I get more volume under their belt with less risk, and we can build a little more progressively. So that's an interesting concept I learned from Charlie Francis is you get to run more, but you don't get that risk of them pushing the entire way, trying to get more intensity. This was an example of volumes, total volumes that I might use in a session with an elite sprinter, right? So we might go anywhere between 300 to 700 meters, depending on the length of the runs. And when you're working with a 100-meter sprinter, you're going to be running 80, 100, 120, 150. And so the mileage adds up, right? But when I'm working with team sport, it's going to be smaller because the needs are smaller, and these are ambitious. I will say that. So even for a soccer player, if they're running 300 to 400 meters per session, that's a lot. If you can do that, you're doing a good job, and you have some control over the scenario. A lot of the time, it's going to be less. But I like putting these numbers out here for different team sports to say, like, this is what I'm shooting for. I'm really shooting for, on average, with all the athletes, the team sport athletes I work with, is let's put at least 300 meters of work divided up over 10s, 15s, 20s per session. If we're doing that at least 2 times per week in the off season, you're going to be ready. So, you try to make that work for yourself. If you're only getting at 150 or 200, great, we'll take it, right? Because I know there's a lot of athletes not doing this work. So you're always thinking about your competition, right? And so this is a diagram of, like, okay, here's the spectrum of athletes at team sport, how it relates to what maybe a track athlete might do, but your per session volume, assuming they're doing 3 sessions per week. So this is an ambitious spectrum here, but this is what I shoot for. Like I said, if I'm working with a rugby player or a soccer player, if I'm getting 300 per session, great. Ideally 3 times per week, but that rarely happens. This was an example of American football, like the heavy big guys. Again, these guys might be 300 pounds versus the receivers, which might be 200 pounds or less. And you can see I try to really just stick to shorter distance for the bigger athletes. And you might do that. It's more of a short to short progression where they do more reps. Whereas if I'm working with somebody who's covering more field when they play, I might be doing less reps as we go through, but the distances expand, right? So the total number of reps might go down relative to the bigger athlete. So maybe, as you see at the end there, 9 reps, but we're on average running 35 yards per rep. Whereas the bigger athletes, 20 reps, but we're on about 10 yards. So you have to think about the positions, and certain sports will require more repeat acceleration. So if you're an American football lineman, you're going every play, whereas the skill players might not be involved, and they might be jogging more. And so you have to think about these individual position differences and sport differences. So to debrief, I think I've used the hour here. Work with the team to establish a culture and an infrastructure for sprint training. So again, you're selling it, you're educating people, you're trying to say, like, how important this is, and that we can't let these deficiencies arise. We can't get away from it, right? I would even say I would fight more for this for a lot of team sports than I would for gym work, because it's so important. You're gonna get better returns. Now, I'm not saying don't do gym work. I'm just saying if you had to, pick one or the other, what would I do? I'm sprinting all of the time, right? Um, so, think about that in terms of educating people around the importance. Monitor the quality of work and improvements regularly. So, yes, you can time and you can test. I would say when I talk about quality of work and improvements, I'm thinking about it technically too. So, if you're having video recordings and you're looking at how people run and the amount of exertion and relaxation they have, that's just as important as whether or not you're timing. Because if you get the technique down and the mechanics down and the intensity down, they're going to run faster. I guarantee it. Be persistent, but not overbearing with your approach. So get the work in. Doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to be yelling and screaming at people. And you don't want people to hate the sprint work. You want them to enjoy it and see the value of it. So you have to come in with a bit of a soft approach. You have to be persistent, but certainly, don't be, the guy that everybody hates. Oh, we're going to do sprinting again, because traditionally running has in sprints has been defined as something that's a punishment for athletes. So we have to get away from that. And I say be an entrepreneur and promote your approach constantly, whether you're working as a private consultant, whether you're working within a team. You have to be constantly promoting, hey, this sprint stuff is really helping, whether you're confirming it with GPS data. Maybe you're confirming it by saying, hey, we have less injuries, we have less hamstring injuries, we have less soft tissue injuries, because I have data to support that with some of the teams I've been working with. So you're constantly, I hate to say it, but you're constantly self-promoting what you're doing, because you have to. This is the game we're in nowadays, and you have to be constantly selling, and because everybody's going to look for something else, right? Everybody's going to look for the new game in town. So I can't emphasize that enough, is that you're constantly promoting this idea that sprinting is important to make our team better. So thank you very much. Hopefully that was useful. I tried to put in as much as possible without boring you to tears and being overbearing, just trying to be persistent. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer, and you can always contact me via email or social media or whatever, and I'll do my best to help answer your questions. Thank you, Andrew.
Derek, I think there's a couple of questions in the Q&A box at the bottom, if you can see those.
Let's see. I'll try and answer a few of the questions that have posted here so far. With limited time, if I wanted to increase acceleration, would you recommend plyos or short sprints? I'm gonna answer live here. I would say I would always lean towards the sprints. I just find you're going to get the benefit of the sprints and the acceleration, and not the same risk, I would say. And it's just more adaptable to what's going to happen when you play your sport. So I'm always going to lean towards getting the sprints done. If you have extra time, you could do some plyos, but most of the plyos I do tend to be more like pogo jumps and foot reactivity drills, and not like big box jumps or hurdle jumps where, again, there's a lot of risk. Another question here was, I work with a boxer, is sprint training beneficial for him? Yeah, a lot of the fighters I've worked with, we do sprints and accelerations all the time. Sorry, I'm just seeing if there's any other questions here.
I think one more just came through, Derek.
Oh, question. What would be the best way to convince a head coach to let us do more? Let us do more specifically by work. To let you do more specific sprint work. I don't know. I mean, it depends on your relationship with the head coach, honestly. Like I've had some head coaches that are, great advocates and would give me whatever I wanted to do within reason. But if you don't have a great relationship with that coach, then it gets a bit more difficult. Um, and I would always try to, again, I'm always trying to relate it back to their sport. And if you had a scenario that you could simulate and say whether it's related to attacking or defending or whatever, or a specific skill in that sport, sort of a passing drill, and then I would integrate some I would say, dare I say, sport specific stuff as part of that. Um, but yeah, I think you're always trying to make it relatable so that they have buy and they go, oh, okay, I see how that applies to my sport.
Looks like that might be
Oh,
all the ones that have
sorry, I
come
can't
through.
hear you,
We'll just
Andrew.
see. We'll see if anything else comes through, but I think that could be about it. Thank you, Derek, for doing this today. I'm sure everyone will agree that it's been really beneficial. I think some of the progressions that you've presented and some of those specific examples are not something that we don't see that often. So that's really, really, really useful. So thank you for that. Derek says he can't hear my audio, but hopefully everyone else can. Maybe it's just muted on there. But thank you everyone for joining us, and please be keep an eye out for more webinars which we'll have coming through, and obviously our conference at the end of the summer as well. And thanks again to our sponsors, Sound Probiotics, Output Sports, and Team Builder. Thanks everyone for coming.